Okay, so good morning, everybody. So this evening we'll have a little game. So you'll have to form groups. Like we want 3 groups of 4 people, and the idea will be to summarize the 2 lectures of this morning, and then you'll have to write or explain us what was the most exciting idea or model, and what was the most confusing idea or model as well. And then you have to identify interesting research question to you, or that could be like of general interest. So you can do that this afternoon while climbing, going away, and before you'll have to drive by car, so maybe it's smart to do a group of people, the people that are going to climb together, they could form a group, something like this. And so just after dinner you can make the presentation, so you could use like slides, or you can just use verbal arguments if you want. Just talk. On the board as well. Any question on that? Okay, then we start. So today we'll talk about niche and impulse conditions. So we heard a little bit about niche and role of species yesterday. So we'll enter in more details about that this morning. So first, what do you know about the niche or niches in ecology? Someone has a definition, or at least a few ideas or a few variables they want to name? Any idea of what the niche is? This is just to wake you up a bit. I can write on the whiteboard.
I think you have to pick someone.
You.
But I don't have a training in ecology, so I think
Wrong.
Wrong answer.
But you can try. Okay, so you spoke, so you can say something.
I guess the way I was taught, niche is kind of the space, not like actual space, but like in data world, the space where an organism would specialize to complete its life cycle. Everything from its habitat to its resources, risks, and conditions.
Okay. So the resources, the habitats, and all this form a space, right? You're not talking about space as spatial, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So and the idea is complete life cycle. Any other ideas?
Well, there's this idea based on interactions. Like, who do you interact with?
Okay.
What's kind of like your role in the ecosystem?
Okay, so you will place it somewhere else, right? The role that you have.
Well, it's more about who you interact with, the resource and habitats. It's less about the biotic conditions, but what's your...
Okay, with the resources, they were already there. So, but it could be different, the resource that you need and the role that you have. So we can place it somewhere else, maybe here. So the role it is about your interactions. Any other ideas? And then I will have to move on because I have a lot of stuff to show you.
I'm going to add to mine a little bit. I think that many times we like to interpret the resources specifically along a gradient, like elevation or temperature.
Okay.
And we like to think of niches as like little spaces on those gradients.
So that's an interaction with the abiotic factor, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's same thing. So I would say it's just a combination of environmental
it's here again, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think we have most of it. So I was like, we can illustrate that with the reintroduction of the wolf in Europe. So he has this niche of requirement, he needs the resources to come in and be able to survive and complete the life cycle. And you also need like the space to be there. And then there is some question that we have in general in ecology is what is the role of the species in the ecosystem. So the role could be, okay, it's a carnivore, but it could be also like a primary producers, a plant, herbivore, but it doesn't tell you really the impact of the species on the system. So the impact will be more about the interactions and the precise way it impacts like other species or other abiotic conditions in the environment. So this leads us to two types of niche. So the first one is the Greenelian niche. I will come back to that. It's about requirements, so it's all the abiotic and abiotic factors needed for survival and growth, so it's this part, right? And the second part is the role of the species in the ecosystem and in its impact. So we are here. So we had like the two types of niches coming from different school of thought, and we'll come back to that. And the idea is that there is no feedback, so it's a one directional effect. So the idea is that the wolf has some requirement, but is not affecting back this requirement. And the idea also is that the impact is unidirectional. But I will come back to that. But I'm just showing one example here with the plant. So the plant needs CO2 to grow and to do the photosynthesis. So that's the niche of requirement, and it's unidirectional, so we assume that the plant is not affecting CO2 in the atmosphere, that CO2 is not limited. And then the plant is producing oxygen. So that's the niche of impact, and the role of the plant is to be a primary producer in the environment. And again, we assume that there is no feedback between oxygen and the plant or the CO2. But ultimately, the oxygen allows the herbivore to be in the place and to eat the plant. So depending on the time scales and the strength of the feed, there may be some feedback. Okay, so today we'll talk about the niche history and the emergence of the two niche concepts, and the factors determining the niche of requirement. So I will mostly focus on the niche of requirement. The niche of impacts will be mainly explained by Azenor on the feedback lecture just after. And then I will discuss how biotic laws can constrain the niche of requirement and how biotic environment can be considered as part of the niche. And how can we still apply the concept of niche under a changing environment? Does it still work? Does it still hold? Can we apply it to changing environment? Because we know that the environment is changing all the time at different time scale, and especially with global change. And then I will name a few applications where the niche is still used a lot. So Joseph Greenell was the one to propose the niche of requirement, and on the other side we had Charles Elton proposing the niche, so the Eltonian niche that was about the role of the species and their impact on the environment. So the idea is that you have like on one side requirement, on the other side the role. So for the requirement, as you explained a little bit before, so we had this idea of the hypervolume of Hutchinson, where you have different factors, and your niche will be the interactions between these different factors. So that's the multidimensional niche. And there he also introduced the concept of the fundamental niche, which is basically all the abiotic factors that constrains the hypervolume. And once you introduce the biotic factors, so the resource you need, for instance, then you constrain this volume into the realized niche. So the niche has become really popular in the last decades, especially in the context of coexistence and competition. So the idea basically was that for competitors to survive, they should have different niches. And there was also the idea of that they should have different impacts on the ecosystem. So here with McArthur and Levin, they kind of merge a bit the two concepts of niche, so the niche of requirement and the niche of impact. So this leads to a bit of confusion in the niche concept. So we start with Grinnell and then McArthur, then the niche theory with all the coexistence theory has merged a bit the two concepts. Then we discussed a little bit yesterday about neural models. In fact, so the niche, so there is no niche, all species are equivalent and it's just random process that allow coexistence. And now, so in the 90s we were a bit lost, and Chase and Nabel in a book proposed a new definition of the niche. So the first definition, so it's a bit more mathematical, but the idea is that for a species to survive, birth has to be superior than growth. So I will explain that a bit later. And the second definition is that at the isocline, so when birth equals growth, what is the impact of a species on the multivariate space? So that's the vector of impact. So at equilibrium in the system, what is the impact of the focal species on the other species or variable in the system? So the niche of impact, as you can see, is just a subset of the Etonian niche. So the impact doesn't tell us really about the role of the species in the ecosystem. It doesn't tell you if it's an apex species or umbrella species or a keystone species, or if it's really a primary producer or an herbivore. So the impact is really the effect on the other variable of the system. So how do we use the niche concept in models? So most of the time the niche of requirement is model parameters, and the niche of impact is model variable, because the niche of impact is the way the focal species impact the other variable in the model. So when can we focus on requirement or impact? So the idea is the requirement will be unidirectional and unaffected. So you start from the biotic and abiotic factors, and they will allow species A to survive, so birth is superior to death. And there is no feedback between the species A and the two kind of factors. And in the niche of impact is the opposite, so that's the impact of species A on the biotic and abiotic environment. And there is also no feedback on the species A. So I will discuss a bit later when this is possible, that there is no feedback, because when you often think about predator-prey models, there is strong feedbacks and all the cycles and so on. But we'll explain a little bit when we can apply this two kind of niche without feedbacks. And as Arnaud will explain a bit more about the niche of impact, when can we ignore feedbacks. So the absence of feedbacks depend on the time scale and on the strength of interactions. So for instance, we often use species distribution model to infer what would be the thermal niche of a species. And the underlying assumption of that is that the species will not change the environmental temperature. And we know this is not possible, right? But so that the idea is that this is really unidirectional. So at the short term, a given species will probably not change atmospheric temperature, but we all know from climate change that in the long term there are some potential feedback. So this illustrates the idea of time scale or interaction strength. So if we were releasing tons and tons of CO2 in 2 minutes, then the climate will suddenly warm, right? So it's also about the strength of interactions. So when we have weak interactions and short time scale, we can probably ignore feedback, but with strong interaction and long time scale, we probably need to account for feedbacks. Just an example for the niche of impact. So the cows, they are stepping on the riverbanks, they are destroying these habitats, but there is no feedback on the cows, right? They are not affected in the short term. Of course, if they destroy all the meadow, then they will be impacted, but that will be at with a stronger interaction strength and a longer time scale. So again. So now I will focus on the niche of requirement, and the niche of impact will be covered in the other lectures. So I was explaining for the niche of requirement, so we say complete life cycle, so in terms of mathematics, like with the really most simple model that we can use, it's just the idea that birth is superior to death for the population growth rate to be positive, right? So this term has to be positive, otherwise the population is going to extinction because this becomes negative and the growth is negative. So you can look at how birth rates change with the resource availability, so that typically it increases. And then if you assume that death rate is constant, then up this point is the point where B is superior to D, so you can start to have, that's the beginning of the niche, and all this area is the niche of the species. So you can do the same for the number of predators that a given species can support. So if there are like low predator density, then B is superior to D. So the niche of the species would be here, right? And then when there are too many predators around, then the mortality is too strong. And you could do the same with some stress. So the assumption here that stress affects both the birth and death rate. So birth has to be superior than death, so the niche will be here. So that's a convenient mathematical definition of the niche that can be used to explore the factors that influence the niche. So you can do that in bivariate space. So here, so this is the case where you have one consumer feeding on two resources. So if you have only one resource, so for instance only resource B, it tells you that you need at least all this resource amount to have a positive growth. So you are in the black area. Same if you have only the resource A, and then the Isaac line is along this line where you can have a mix of the two resources that would have the persistence of the species. This is the case where you have two predators feeding on one prey, or two consumers on one resource. So if you have too much of predator B, then you cannot survive. If you have too much of predator A, you cannot survive. And then when you have both predators present, it is a mix of their densities. So this is for a trophic chain. You need enough resources, but not too many predators to survive. And this is for stress, intensity, and resource. So here you will have resources and stress. Well, what I find interesting here is that these two graphs are exactly the same. So here the idea is that you consider predator or resources as like a stress, so a constant pressure that is not changing. So the density of predator is not changing to time and resources as well. So you assume here no feedback, and you can see it straight when you compare these two graphs. They are the same. So you consider a constant stress pressure. So that's the idea of the niche. So you probably know about that, but you have like specialist and generalist. So the raccoon along one niche axis that has to be defined, can have a larger niche than the panda, and there is all this literature on generalist and specialist and the trade-off that you have between maximal performance and the breadth of the niche. You could think within a species you may have different niche for larva, juvenile, and adults, and you said that before. So the niche of the species would be like the overall, so it will be the overall area covering all the different stages. Okay, yeah, we'll skip that. So now we'll explore the factor determining the niche of requirement. So using like what are the factors that can influence birth and death. And so using this simple mathematical definition, we can start exploring the factors that determines the niche. So for instance, it could be a temperature, nutrients, space, time, body size, and we show before a few examples with predator, resources, and stress. So we can use abiotic laws to understand how the niche emerge from these simple laws coming from physics and chemistry and physiology as well. So among the different theories, you have the metabolic theory of ecology and ecological stoichiometry that can be used to predict some of the niche aspects. So I don't know if you heard about these two theories, if you are familiar with that. But basically the metabolic theory of ecology is based on the idea that most biological rates are constrained by our physiology and metabolic rate. And this follows an exponential relationship with temperature because of the speed of chemical relationship. And there is an allometric exponent on the body mass that depends on the fractal structure of the distribution of energy in the cells. At least it's one explanation. In fact, it's mostly empirical, the value of these parameters. And so the main component of this theory are body mass and temperature. And the idea is that the stoichiometry is fixed, so we are mostly looking at energy fluxes. Whereas in the other theory, you look at a weak homeostasis, so the ratio of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus can vary. And you can use this theory to predict the niche of a species given on its metabolic requirement and its nutrient requirement as well. So this is just a really simple example with temperature. So for a consumer, the birth you can assume, so as in the L'Octave-Alclar model, you will assume that the birth rate depends on the amount of prey or resource that a predator can consume, times assimilation efficiency, so that's how much of the prey you can convert into new biomass, times the attack rate of the consumer on the resource, minus some metabolic losses that depend on what I just showed before with the metabolic theory of ecology. And if you look at, so this is a metabolic rate here in green, increasing exponentially at least up to maximal, and ingestion rate, which would be the equivalent of attack rate, then this gives you the niche of the species. That is birth superior to death. So this is in terms of energy, but it's the same concept that applies. And if you look at the thermal niche as the amount of energy that you can gain from the difference between these two curves, you'll get a shape like this, which reminds like a lot of things that you can measure directly from the life cycles of species. And I will explain a bit later what is the black line here. So then we can use stoichiometric constraints to see how this interact with temperature to influence the niche. Here we used a modified version of the model I was just showing before. So here you can see the same equation, but here the only thing is that the assimilation efficiency depends on the stoichiometric quality of the resource. So basically, if you are eating vegetables, the assimilation efficiency is lower, so you need to eat a lot of vegetables to convert them into a new biomass. But us as carnivores, if you eat meat, then it's easier to convert into new biomass. So depending on your stoichiometric requirement, and I'm not I'm not adverting for eating meat. But it's just easier to assimilate something that looks like you, I mean that has the same stoichiometric composition, than something that is really different. At least this is what you get with empirical data. And so the idea is that the food quality can constrain the niche. So that's the niche basically without considering food quality. And that's the niche where you would consider food quality. So what happens with temperature is that usually in this kind of model, when temperature increases, then the food quality becomes lower, and this restrains the niche of the species to a smaller temperature range and lower performance as well. So another powerful thing is the use of redox potential. So yeah.
When you talk about food quality, are you only looking at it from like an energy perspective, or is there also potential to look at it from like actual like nutritional aspects? Like
yeah, so I'm talking about C and P ratio.
okay.
So you need like so that's the ratio of so it's about quality. So that's the ratio of phosphorus over carbon. So it's really the nutrient you can get out of the food. Yeah. Whereas, so if you, in the first version here, you would only consider the quantity of the food. So you assume that the assimilation efficiency is constant. So no matter the food quality that you have, you will always get the same energy out of the food.
Yeah, I was thinking more of like if I eat meat, it's more efficient than compared to eating vegetables. But if I never eat, citrus fruits, I get scurvy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm not considering co-limitation with other with other nutrients that you need.
Okay.
Yeah, but the list of these nutrients is really long.
Right.
So you could explore this co-limitation, but here in this simple toy model, we mainly use three main nutrients that are carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, because we know that nitrogen and phosphorus are the most limiting nutrient for many species, for plants and herbivores and carnivores. So the other ones, they come out as a secondary limitation.
Actually, Arnaud, on the topic, it seems to me, but I'm not an expert at all in those things, that people often have this C and P viewpoints when looking at aquatic life, marine life, especially, because of plankton and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And you think it's something that's a bit more specific of certain fields like this, or?
Yeah, I think as you say, it's more specific to a freshwater system because so for herbivore and carnivore, the stoichiometry is more or less fixed. So so you observe that this ratio, they don't vary much and they are more or less constant. But for plants, they can vary quite a lot. And in freshwater, most of the plants are in unicellular algae and they develop quickly and they don't invest much in defense. Whereas on terrestrial system, they invest a lot in defense. So we heard yesterday about tannins and so on. And here, the idea of CNP for food quality does no longer work well because you have all these defense compounds that have been developed by plants on terrestrial systems. So that's why I think it's mainly used in aquatic freshwaters or aquatic system, marine and freshwater, and mostly with unicellular algae that are not developing a lot of defense compound. Yeah, so for the redox, so we know that aerobic organisms, they need like suboxic or oxic condition to persist, and the anaerobic organisms, they will live in anoxic condition. So this is a strong determinant of the type of organisms that you can have in the environment. Body size also can be very important because it's integrating, in fact, a lot of different things. So in this paper, I forgot the name of the author, Anderson, it's here. So basically the idea is that depending on your body size, you will be able to do different things. So for body temperature, if you're really small, then your surface to volume ratio, it will be quite high compared to your mass. So then you will not be able to be homeotherm in the ocean because it's not energetically worthy to be homeotherm if you are too small. So for the kind of resource encounter strategy that you use is also the same. So to be an heterotroph, so to be a consumer, you need to be large enough to ingest smaller ones. You need also to move fast to catch your prey. So you need to be large enough to be an heterotroph. It's the same for the mobility regime. It's around the same idea. So if you are really small, you don't swim, you don't run, so you have more Brownian motion movement. If you are super large, then you can have inertia and active movement. So then you will mostly be an heterotroph. And the sensing mode is the same, so if you are really small, you mostly use chemical and mechanical sensing, whereas when you are super large, you can use vision or acoustic. So if you take body size and integrative trait, then you look at, if you are super large, you are an homeotherm, heterotroph, you have active movement and you use acoustic. And on the opposite, if you are super small, then you are heterotherm, osmotroph, you use Brownian motion, you use mostly chemical and mechanical sensing, and you multiply to cell division. So you can see here that body size is an integrative traits integrating all this dimension of the niche. This I already explained. Okay. Yeah, I will keep that. Okay, let's go to the biotic environment. So the biotic environment, so you have the case of nurse species with the idea that there is no feedback, at least at the short term, on a species that is a nurse, so providing, for instance, an habitat to a given species. So this frog is living on this nice plant, and we assume that the frog is not affecting the plant, at least on the short time. And in the example yesterday, we could also apply the niche concept to this sea urchin and sea otter system, where you could think that urchin are here and they are the niche of requirement for the sea otter, and this is unidirectional. But you could also think that sea otters are here and they also are part of the niche of requirement of sea urchin, because if they would be like too numerous, they would prevent the sea urchin to come in. So that was the idea that we discussed here with prey having to predators or in a food chain. Yeah. So, and in the next lecture, we'll discuss a bit when this breaks down. So when you have a feedback loop between sea urchin and sea otters. Okay. Yes, that's it. Okay, so can we still apply the niche concept when the environment is changing? So the answer is yes. So fixed means not impacted by the species, but it doesn't mean that it's fixed in time. So we all heard about climate change and the idea that temperature is changing. So the niche concept will still apply, so the thermal niche will still remain the same even if the environment is changing. But the idea is that the niche shape can change in time. So for instance, with latitude, you'll have, with climate change, so that will be the spatial niche of the species. You will find it along this latitude gradient. And with warming, then you will have another spatial niche, a different one. So you could still apply the niche, but you have to account for the fact that the environment is changing. So that's a little bit the interactions between abiotic factors, between different factors. So in the hypervolume that that I was showing at the beginning, it will just be moving along the axis of the hypervolume. So when the change is not directional but recurring, then you can have temporal niches, so you know about days and night niches. You also have seasonal preferences. So when the environment is changing, it's also opening the opportunity to have different niches. But the thing that you have to be careful also is that when the environment is changing, the thing that, yes? No question? Sit here. When the environment is changing, then the strength of interaction can also change. And then what you assume to be a weak interaction can become a strong interaction. And then the concept of the niche could no longer work. So for instance, if you have a forest, and that is affected by herbivores, but to a lower extent before climate change, then you could argue that the impact of the herbivore on the forest are weak. But with climate change, if the forest is already stressed, then you add another stressor, then you can have a really strong impact of the herbivore on the forest. So it tells you that the rules that you had before about the absence of feedback or the absence of impact can change as well with the changing environment. So you have to be careful with that. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yes?
I've always struggled with trying to figure out what's the appropriate definition of a niche for organisms that are highly migratory and they occupy very different ecosystems, but at the same time, you need to complete that full journey to have any influence on the birth rate.
Yeah. Yeah. So you probably need to integrate the different. So it depends on what you are. So probably depend on. Yeah, I will discuss. No, I remove that. Yeah, the idea is that you need to integrate the different niche to be able to predict the birth rate of the population. So I think if there is one limiting stage, you probably should focus on the niche of this stage in particular. Or look at all the different niche of the different life stage they integrate into each other. So for instance, for temperature, we know that the eggs of the fish, they are much more sensitive than the adults. So the niche will be the most restraining stage. So you need to focus on this niche first. You don't necessarily need to consider the niche of all the different stages. So you will have to restrain as much as you can your upper volume, or you need to build like a small toy model where you would integrate the different niches for the different stages. So you can use a stage structure model where your species would have different niches. And this will tell you especially if they live in different places, if they are migratory and they have different constraints and in different environments. Yes?
If time of the year is a factor, it's just that your hypervolume is varying with this dimension.
Or either that you try to keep the same hypervolume through the year by doing.
So if time of the year is a variable, so what do you mean?
So I mean that in your hypervolume you have factors.
Yeah.
You can say that time of the year is a factor.
Yeah.
And then it's just that non-migratory species are constant through this dimension, while migratory species have a niche that evolves through time.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Like the Arctic term, for instance. Like that.
Yeah.
You have temperature like that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, you could have that. Yes. Yeah. I think it's a little bit the same idea as separating the niche depending on your spatial location.
Yeah,
they correlate together. So, yeah. Yes.
If I can jump in on this, I think related to what you were saying about the most constraining part, I think that's a very useful way to think, because niche is always very multidimensional. We know there are always many things happening. So maybe focusing on the bottleneck is the way that you can get at least a more clear explanation of what may happen. But of course, the bottleneck can change.
Yeah. It can change depending on like environmental change. So what is the most constraining factor at a given time of the year or a given year could be something different the year after. So this year we have a really warm fall, but last year was not the case, so might be changing the factors that are most limiting depending on the year or the conditions. I mean the time. Okay. So the niche is often used to answer the question of which species presents of abundance response to factors. So that's what we often do in experiments and what we do with field survey. So basically you have species presence absence or species abundance, and you want to explain that. So you use sample all your abiotic factors, the community composition, and you want to know this biotic and abiotic factor, the different species abundance. So you use stats, so variance partitioning, for instance. And here you are using, so you are implicitly using the niche of requirement, because you do not allow like feedbacks between these different factors. Even though if like the end results of species presence abundance, it depends on the feedbacks between the species and its community composition.
Yeah, I think that's the main limitation of species distribution rules.
Yeah.
And I don't really see how this can be resolved using statistical analysis.
Yeah.
Can you say it again? I think this problem is the main limitation of species distribution rules. I don't see any solution, because technically, if you use statistics, there is a response variable and
Yeah, that's a problem of stats.
variables, and that's it. You cannot allow feedbacks.
Yeah. Yeah, there is. Well, path analysis are like you can do a slightly better job than.
Can you input feedbacks? I don't think so.
No, you cannot do. You cannot do feedbacks, but you can like partition the indirect effects of one variable. So this is not feedbacks, but at least you would account for the indirect effects, for instance, of abiotic factor on community composition.
I agree with what you said, that you always assume a direct effect. At the end of the day, you're always assuming that there is something causing something else.
Yeah.
And that's the underlying idea of any statistical
Yeah.
model. That's why we have diagonal models.
That can't be cyclic.
If that's so, then you cannot infer anymore.
Yeah.
Without time, right? If you just from statistics, that's
Yeah, so talking about SDM, so yeah, the niche is often used in SDM. So from the spatial distribution of the species, you can estimate their niche. So there could be pH, temperature, presence of other species. So the idea again is unidirectional, as we just discussed. So in a lot of empirical work, we assume that there is no feedback. So for instance, the niche of requirement. So when we do predated diets, plant nutrient requirement. So we just want to know what a predator or plants needs. And we assume like no feedbacks when we are doing this kind of experiments. For conservation, you just ask, okay, are the conditions in this place good enough for my species to persist, but you don't really care about feedbacks on how your species will affect its own resources. And in the niche of impact, so we can often do like short-term experiments, for instance, where we manipulate biotic or abiotic factor as a constant environmental pressure. So for instance, I did a lot of experiments like this during my PhD, where you add a fixed number of predators and you investigate the impact on prey population. So you are asking like what is the niche of requirement of the prey population, so like how much predator it can withstand without going to extinction, so that the birth rate is superior to the death rate. And you're also looking at the impact of the predator on prey without accounting for feedbacks, because you do not allow the dynamic of the predator to go on. And we tend to do the same when there is a new invasive species coming in. Okay, what is the impact or the role of this invasive species in the new ecosystem? And in the short term, at least we don't like pay too much attention about the feedbacks. But in the long term, what we often observe is that the invasive species, then they get like new predators, or they become limited by a virus or by something else. So the feedbacks, they start to occur, and sometimes the invasive species, they are no longer invasive because of feedbacks. In agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry, it is used a lot. So here you want actively to get rid of the feedbacks. So you are providing all the nutrients to the plants or to the fish or to the cows, and you don't want feedback, so you are providing a constant input of nutrients. And also, it is often used now with climate change to try to predict the vulnerability of species to climate change. So I was showing this thermal performance curve before, where you reach upper thermal limit, and the distance between the actual temperature and the upper thermal limit is used as the thermal safety margin. So again, here is the idea of using the niche to predict the vulnerability of species. So it's widely used in this context also nowadays with ICMs. Yeah, so with that I will conclude the lecture. I don't know if I was fast or not. A bit fast, yeah. I will have more time for coffee. Questions? Oh, questions, yeah, of course. So yeah, I just showed that there is like two concepts of the niche that came from the Greenlandian niche and the Eltonian niche, and that abiotic and biotic factor can be part of the niche, but this we already discussed a bit before. And that you have macro niche, though. So for instance, I wanted to say about the temperature can lead to endotherm versus exotherm and micro niche, so the different stages within a species. And the niche is dominant in applied ecology, so in agriculture, conservation, and aquaculture. And the niche concept is most often assumed in statistical models, even though if we don't really realize it when we use them. And in the next lecture, we'll discuss when and how this paradigm can be correct. So when can we assume that there is no feedbacks, basically. Yeah. So if you have any question, I would be happy to discuss that with you.
Yeah, but so like what I understood from these two concepts, so the niche impact does not really change the niche requirement. So if you have this feedback, so you can only change the conditions but not the niche requirement.
Yeah, so the assumption is that it's not changing, but as you just mentioned, if the variables are the same, so then you quickly see that you have a problem and you need probably to account for this feedback. And in the next lecture, we'll investigate that in more details.
Yeah,
so in the data prey system, for instance, your requirement is the prey, and your impact is also on the prey. So you quickly understand that you have an issue if you assume that there is no feedback.
Yeah, whereas the kind of situations in which you could easily assume something like this kind of separation, when you really have, each species or each group takes something and produces something else, then that thing is taken by someone else who produces something else, which is how some people think, for instance, metabolic networks in microbes, carbon sources. Some microbes, they degrade the complex carbons, then this makes simpler carbons that can be taken up by someone else, or then you really have this kind of chain directed to the point. Yeah, there's this kind of very directed idea in the niche, since if you want it to work, at least that's the simpler case.
Yeah, the emergence of eukaryotes on Earth, they were there because oxygen was pollution produced by bacteria. So the impact was not related to the requirement in this case. But billions of years later, but was feedbacking on them because then eukaryotes were feeding on bacteria.
So are you saying that through climate change we'll create superorganisms that will eat us?
No, I don't think so. We'll be brave enough to destroy ourselves.
I feel like all this niche concept is always species specific and it does not take into account most of the abiotic interaction with other beings are really poorly described. And do you think that like constructing niches at the community level might be a way to take this into account? So if we think of the niche as the niche of a group of organisms, it obviously includes the relationship between organisms, and so the variation of the environmental parameters will also affect those relationships. So do you think it's a way to overcome this issue?
So you would, I think so. It's one way to address this maybe is like to build a community model where you want the coexistence of your species in the system, and then you look at the abiotic factor that still allows this coexistence between the different species to persist. Because otherwise, I don't see, because your feedbacks between your species, they will change depending on the condition. So if you don't account for this, I don't really see how you can take a pool of species and say, okay, they are able to persist here, but they are no longer to persist here, without accounting for their interactions. So I would probably do that, but but this is, I'm kind of doing that sometimes where you have community models and you want to understand how the temperature, for instance, climate change impacts the dynamic and the persistence of the species. So you are asking in a way, what is the niche of requirement of my community when you are doing that? But from pure field data. I don't know work about that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you know any kind of review or any kind of general overview of how many species are actually, on multiple niches like this through migration or life stages or being amphibians, or like for instance, I once met a forest ecologist who had this very nice definition of a tree. So for him, a tree is a species that connects soil conditions with atmospheric conditions. And if you don't grow tall enough, like for instance in the Arctic, there are some tree species that they stay very tiny because they stay very close to the ground. And for him, it's not a tree because it doesn't connect to atmospheric conditions. It's still basically controlled by soil conditions and soil temperature and whatnot. And so it seems that many different types of solutions in life are trying to connect to different environments or multiple different environments. And I wonder, do you have any notion of how common that is and if it's basically universal?
No, I don't know how common it is, but I think it's quite common and it's under studied. And at least in freshwater, like most insects, like they develop in water, but then they emerge and they become terrestrial or flying insects. So it's a little bit the same idea as the tree. They connect land and water. And yeah, like among patches, so we discussed a bit about meta ecosystems. So you have like also a lot of organisms that are developing in different habitats when they grow or they migrate. So they connect also like different ecosystems together. But I don't know if there is a review about that, like quantifying like how frequent is that. I guess from like functional traits database, you could maybe estimate that without too much effort. Because this is the kind of traits that is often like recorded.
I guess I also had a thought, was it just seems like from any niche definition, all of the factors that we're thinking about are almost always external to the organism. And is there any value of thinking about niches from an internal perspective, like your interactions with different bacteria or viruses or parasites or anything that would influence your birth rate?
Yeah, so in the niche perspective, the virus and bacteria, but they are still viewed as external to you. Even it's still an interaction, and you could consider that it's still external. So for me, internal would be like what is the niche of your liver, for instance, like how well it can function. I guess you could. As I was showing with the life stages, you could like construct the niche of all your organs and try to understand what is the niche of the whole organism in itself. So maybe doing something like this. But I think it's a little bit the idea with the slide I was showing on the body size also, like trying to decompose all the niche you could get from the organism given his size or what he's able to do.
So from your experience, so what do you think would be like the two main niche requirements for organisms or something like that?
So one niche is food. We all need food.
Yeah.
Sure. So that's the first niche. And I'm biased, I would say temperature, but temperature is like super important for a lot of species. What do you think of other variables?
Certainly temperature.
I mean, sorry?
Temperature, I would say.
Yeah. Nutrients, temperature.
Refugees from, if you sleep, you need a place to sleep.
Yeah, habitat.
Habitat.
Yeah, an habitat. Yeah, place to live.
Do you have any idea of when temperature became so big as part of the niche description?
When?
Yeah, I guess it's already implicit in what Sebastian was presenting yesterday with the attitudinal and latitudinal patterns, so probably already from both.
Yeah.
Both,
I don't know exactly, but already with the idea of the bioma and like all the biogeography, the description of species and where they live, I think there was already the idea that temperature was affecting quite a lot of the distribution of the species, and all the rules, change rules, Bergman rules, and all these different rules that were like in the 19th century for some of them. So it's about 200 years ago probably already. And yes?
What do you think is the best trait for a species to explain like how far the niche, the hypervolume of niche is? Like for example, I don't know, body size or intraspecific niche. So how wide the niche gets to all life stages of species.
So if there is a trait that could explain like how wide the niche is, but at the intraspecific level.
I feel that body size is part of it because I guess you don't have very different life stages exploring very different environments when you're a unicell. I guess. Maybe that's not even true. But I think it's probably not the only. I mean, generalism versus specialism happens at all sizes, right? You can be an extremely specialized, very big animal, like a panda. Probably not very good for you.
Couldn't it be especially like intraspecific variability in intraspecific diversity?
Yeah.
Could like most generalists are population of specialists.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're specialist in very different topics and you get to wide niche.
Yeah. Yeah, I think ontogeny and genetic or epigenetic diversity, phenotypic diversity. I think for ontogeny, instead of body size, I will take like the fold change in body size to ontogeny. Because all species, they are born, like all the individuals are born small to more or less extent. And then the fold change in body size could give you an idea of like the width of the niche.
This is related to what is called the niche variation hypothesis. When the niche occupied by the species becomes wider, is it because individuals are more diverse inside this particular species?
But there is also the generalist specialist debate that if you want to be more generalist, then you will perform. Your performance will be lower in the middle of the niche compared to the specialist, because there is a trade-off in your ability to like withstand extremes versus your maximum performance. So you cannot be good in all conditions. That's the idea. But if you take that at the species level and then you consider the intraspecific variation, then different phenotypes of the same species could be good in different places along the niche axis. And then at the species level, you could have this generalist species that is performing like better than a specialist species. So you have to be careful, I think, of when you try to compare things because of that. Okay, so we can go for a coffee break. Thank you.